Her son struck her across the cheek, right there at the Thanksgiving table. Evelyn Parrish, retired school principal and widow, didn't flinch. David, her only son and once co-signer on her bank account, smirked and reached for more wine. By sunrise, he'd be locked out of the deed, the credit line, and every room he once claimed without asking. She'd buried her husband with grace. She wasn't burying herself. And when her son tried to roar back in, the court order would speak louder than blood. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The Thanksgiving table gleamed beneath the low, amber light of the chandelier Evelyn had polished herself that morning. The scent of rosemary and roasted yams mingled with baked apples and stuffing, but no one was eating with real appetite. The plates were full, but conversation came in awkward trickles. Safe topics only, like weather, football, and vague allusions to Jenna's college applications. Evelyn sat at the head of the long cherrywood table, her posture straight, her breath steady. She wore her late husband's favorite earrings, small sapphires, delicate and understated. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her eyes moved constantly, tracking every shift in tone, every rising decibel in her son's voice, every darting glance between Jenna and Melanie. David had been drinking since noon. Nothing new, but today he seemed to be pressing harder than usual, like the holiday gave him permission to perform his grievances a little louder, a little more publicly. His words weren't slurred, not yet, but each sentence came with an edge that turned every toast into a warning. "And if some people in this house actually appreciated what I do," David was saying, waving his fork in the air like a judge's gavel, "maybe I wouldn't have to keep repeating myself every damn year." Evelyn gently placed her water glass on the coaster. Her voice was quiet, barely louder than a whisper, but it carried with the weight of a woman used to being listened to. "David, let's lower our voices. This is Thanksgiving, not a debate." He looked at her, his lips curling upward into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Right, because everything's always my fault." "I didn't say that," she replied calmly. "I'm asking for civility." "And I'm asking for respect," he snapped, pushing back from the table so fast that his wineglass toppled and bled across the white linen tablecloth. The sharp scent of Merlot mingled with cranberry sauce. Jenna jumped slightly at the noise, her fork clattering against her plate. Melanie reached out to dab at the spill with a napkin, but no one was looking at the stain anymore. They were looking at David. And David was looking at his mother. "You want civility?" he growled. "How about this for civility?" Without warning, he took 2 steps toward her, and in a flash that seemed both sudden and rehearsed, his hand came down across Evelyn's face. The sound echoed, sharp, flat, final. The entire room froze. Jenna's chair scraped loudly as she shot to her feet and rushed to her grandmother's side, panic widening her eyes. "Grandma," she whispered, placing a tentative hand on Evelyn's arm. Melanie let out a brittle gasp, but didn't move from her seat, her knuckles white around her napkin. Evelyn didn't cry out. She didn't fall. Her cheek flushed, but her composure remained eerily intact. Slowly, she turned her head back toward David, not with fear, but with something colder, an appraising silence that made the room feel suddenly smaller. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, Evelyn moved. With the poise of someone who had made a decision long before this moment arrived, she reached for the bottle of Cabernet near the centerpiece. The room watched as she poured a glass with careful precision, her hand steady, the liquid swirling quietly inside the crystal. She held the glass aloft. Not high, not dramatic, just high enough. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice smooth and clipped with finality. Then she took a sip, not rushed, not defiant, just finished. David stood there, stunned, as if waiting for the usual unraveling. Tears, apologies, excuses, but none came. Melanie opened her mouth, maybe to defend him, maybe to plead, but no sound followed. Jenna, still at Evelyn's side, looked up at her grandmother with wide eyes, her breathing slow, her shoulders no longer hunched. Evelyn set the glass down on the table and turned toward the kitchen, Her footsteps soft but certain, the silk of her cardigan brushing past the edge of Jenna's plate. She didn't look back. David remained frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, unsure of what he had just triggered. The house was quieter than it had any right to be, given what had just happened. Outside, the wind moved through the barren oaks like a whisper passed between neighbors. Inside, Evelyn stood in her study, the old one at the back of the house, the room with the French doors, and the creaky floorboard near the corner window. She hadn't been in here in months, not really, not with purpose. Now she moved with precise intent. The drawer of the walnut filing cabinet groaned as she pulled it open. The brass handle had dulled over the years, but her fingers found it without hesitation. She flipped through hanging folders with a rhythm that was almost meditative. School pension documents, the old will she and Charles had drafted before his surgery, property tax receipts from as far back as '91, and then she found it. The original deed, heavy cream cardstock, blue embossed stamp from Roanoke County. Her name typed in bold, centered, and singular. No co-signatures, no liens, no shared stake. She held it in her hands and let the paper speak for itself. This house, this history, this long stretch of time lived and endured. It belonged entirely to her. She laid the document flat on the desk and kept going. In a separate folder marked Legal David, she found a stapled stack of papers she had nearly forgotten about. Nearly. They were copies of a power of attorney draft he'd tried to slide past her 2 years ago, wrapped in his usual charm, masked in concern about planning ahead. The memory rose in her like a bad taste. David hovering near the coffee machine, telling her things were just easier this way, that handling money's a burden at your age. She hadn't signed, thank God. Outside the study, the TV blared from the living room, some football game with commentators barking statistics over crowd noise. David's voice cut through occasionally, too loud, too performative, like a man desperate to reclaim a center that no longer held. Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge the sound at all. Behind her, the door creaked open, bare feet padded across the carpet. Jenna stood there, arms folded tightly across her chest, her sweatshirt sleeves pulled down over her palms. Her face was blank, but her eyes held something deeper. Not shock anymore, not even confusion. "I can't believe he hit you," she said, her voice hushed, like a confession she wasn't sure she was allowed to make. Evelyn didn't look up from the papers. "He's always wanted control. Last night he reached for the kind he could never earn." Jenna stepped closer. "You don't deserve what he did." Evelyn looked at her granddaughter fully then, eyes clear and sharp behind her reading glasses. "He's about to get exactly what he does deserve." For a moment, Jenna said nothing. Then she gave a single nod, the kind of nod that signaled she understood more than she was supposed to at her age. Evelyn reached for her phone, tapped open her contacts, and found Walter Green's name. His was still saved with an old photo from a Christmas party years ago. He'd been wearing a reindeer tie and sipping cider with something stronger mixed in. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard for only a second. "It's time. Tomorrow. Send." Down the hallway, David let out a whooping cheer as his team scored. Evelyn and Jenna both heard the distinct slosh of liquid hitting glass. Then came the sound of him yelling at the screen, shouting at players who couldn't hear him. Evelyn folded the deed, placed it in a protective sleeve, and slid it into her leather satchel with the rest of the legal documents. She closed the drawer slowly, deliberately, like sealing a vault. "I'm going to need your help tomorrow," she said without looking at Jenna. Jenna didn't hesitate. "You have it." The attic door creaked louder than Evelyn remembered. Not that anyone else would notice. David never ventured up here, and Melanie wouldn't climb 2 flights unless it involved a mirror and good lighting. But Evelyn knew every noise this house made, and tonight the floorboards didn't protest her presence. They seemed to welcome it. She pulled the cord to the bare bulb hanging from the low ceiling. The room flooded with a pale, golden light that caught dust motes mid-air. Boxes lined the back wall, labeled in her own tight handwriting, property records, Charles's medical, utilities 99 to 5, Miss. A few were unopened since Charles's passing. In the center of the room stood a small wooden desk. She had placed it there 15 years ago, back when she thought she might use the attic as a writing space. She never wrote much, but the desk had stayed, sturdy, untouched, waiting. Now she sat down and opened her laptop. Her fingers moved with quiet purpose. First, the messages. She navigated through the screenshots Jenna had forwarded to her over the past year. The texts David had sent in bursts of rage, demands for money, veiled threats, guilt-laced ultimatums. He rarely said anything outright, but the tone was always there, like a splinter just beneath the skin. "You're lucky I even let you stay in that house. I should have taken over after Dad died. Everyone expected me to. You're playing old lady games with what should have been mine." Each one was saved, organized into folders by month. Evelyn downloaded them all to a flash drive and printed a copy for Walter. As the printer on the lower shelf buzzed to life, she turned to the next task. Melanie's social media, public enough to be foolish, frequent enough to be useful. Evelyn scrolled through screenshots she'd taken from Jenna's phone. Backhanded captions on filtered photos, mocking references to boomer drama, passive-aggressive comments about living with ghosts who won't die and give you the damn house already. Each image printed with a soft mechanical rhythm. Evelyn didn't blink. This was no longer about her pride. It was about the record, about facts that could not be rewritten in David's voice or erased by family silence. Behind her, the attic stairs groaned again. Jenna appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs. She looked like she hadn't slept, but there was a quiet steadiness about her now, like the ground beneath her had shifted, but she had decided to stand anyway. "I brought chamomile," Jenna said, offering one of the mugs. "Figured you could use something besides adrenaline." Evelyn accepted it with a nod, setting it beside the printer. Jenna looked at the piles forming on the desk, the pages of texts, the printouts of Melanie's posts, the organized folders Evelyn had sorted with unnerving speed. "Is this really happening?" Jenna asked, almost to herself. Evelyn leaned back in the chair. "It already did. Now we document." They worked for another hour, Jenna stapling and labeling, while Evelyn handwrote a timeline, dates, incidents, amounts. Not one word was exaggerated. She didn't need fiction. She had evidence. When the folder was thick enough to close with effort, Evelyn tapped the cover once and opened her phone. Walter answered after the first ring. "I have everything," she said without preamble. "Texts, credit statements, social posts, a full timeline." "Good," Walter replied. "I'll add it to the petition. We're filing for full eviction, plus a protective condition for Jenna considering the witness account." Evelyn's eyes flicked toward her granddaughter. "Do it." They hung up without fanfare. Later, after Jenna had gone to bed and the house was again quiet except for David's muffled snoring through the floorboards, Evelyn made one final trip to the upstairs master bedroom. She stood outside the door a long moment before unlocking it. This had once been her sanctuary, the place she had shared with Charles. Over time, it had become just a room. Then, somehow, David had claimed it. Without permission, without gratitude, just possession by presence. She stepped inside. Nothing had changed. The musky aftershave David used lingered faintly in the air. The comforter was half kicked off. There was an empty beer bottle on the nightstand and a pair of socks on the floor. It didn't smell like home anymore. It smelled like trespass. From her pocket, she pulled out the new Schlage deadbolt and screwdriver set Jenna had helped her pick up at the hardware store that morning. She worked quietly. No lights, no noise. The screws tightened clean. The lock clicked shut. She tested the door from the hallway. Sealed. The house had gone still in that particular way it only did after midnight, when even the floorboards stopped complaining and the heat vents exhaled in long, slow sighs. The only light came from the dim glow of the front porch bulb, casting soft gold across the hallway tiles. Evelyn moved like she belonged to the shadows. The manila envelopes were thick and sealed. One for David, one for Melanie. Printed names in clean block letters. Legal, unmistakable, final. She paused at their door. Just down the hallway she could hear David's uneven snore, something between a wheeze and a rumble. He had passed out earlier with the TV still on, another half-empty glass of whiskey sweating onto the coffee table. Melanie had vanished into their room after cleaning up the dinner dishes she hadn't cooked. No one said goodnight. Evelyn reached into the side pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a roll of blue painter's tape. Scotch would peel the finish. She'd thought about that. She'd thought about everything. 2 strips across each envelope, one horizontal, one vertical, centered on the wood like they'd been posted by a sheriff. She stepped back, surveyed her work, and allowed herself a quiet exhale. She didn't gloat. She just walked back down the hall, heels softly brushing the hardwood, and closed her own door. The screaming began at 7:16 a.m. It started with a sharp male roar, the sound of disbelief colliding with entitlement. Then came the thud of something being kicked, probably the dresser. Melanie's voice joined seconds later, high-pitched and shrill, followed by another thump, and then footsteps charging down the hallway. Evelyn sat in the armchair near her window, wrapped in a flannel robe, a mug of black coffee in her lap. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply waited. The pounding came hard against her. Door. "Mom! What the hell is this?" David's voice was raw with sleep and fury. "You think you can pull some legal stunt and not even talk to me?" Evelyn remained still. The coffee was just warm enough to sip. He slammed his fist against the door again. "Open the damn door!" Melanie's voice cut in, softer but edged with calculation. "Evelyn, it was the wine. You know how he gets. Holidays are hard. You've seen it before. Don't blow everything up over one moment." Inside the room, Evelyn set her mug down on the windowsill. Her fingers brushed the curtain aside. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked once, then went quiet. The wind stirred the tall pines. She raised her voice just enough to carry through the wood. "You do," she said evenly. "And you stayed." Silence followed. A long, thick pause like someone had dropped a curtain. She heard the click of Melanie's shoes as they turned away. David cursed under his breath. A door slammed. The quiet returned, but it felt altered, more aware of itself. The house had felt haunted before. Now it felt alert. A knock came, this time gentle, at Evelyn's door. "Grandma?" Evelyn stood and opened it. Jenna stood there in pajama bottoms and a college hoodie, barefoot and pale, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "They read them," she said quietly. "I heard them yelling for 10 minutes. I thought he was going to break something." "He already has," Evelyn replied, brushing a hand gently across Jenna's shoulder. "But now we've put it on paper." Jenna hesitated, then looked toward the end of the hall where her small bedroom door stood partially open. "I want to start packing, just in case." Evelyn didn't blink. "You'll take the master." Jenna's eyes widened. "But that's your room." "No," Evelyn said calmly. "My room was taken. Now I'm taking it back, by giving it to someone who knows what respect feels like." The girl didn't argue. She nodded, the kind of slow, stunned nod that meant something old inside her had just shifted. Together, they walked down the hallway past David and Melanie's door. The notice envelopes had been torn off, but the tape remained, small, silent proof that something had been delivered, and nothing would be the same. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Morrison's clinic had always been too bright for Evelyn's taste, clinical in the truest sense of the word. But that morning, as she sat on the paper-lined exam table, those overhead bulbs felt oddly welcome. They didn't hide anything. They revealed. "I know why you're here," Dr. Morrison said gently, setting her stethoscope down. "Let's document everything, thoroughly." Evelyn gave a single nod. They began with a full physical. Blood pressure, reflexes, pupil dilation. The bruise on her cheek had begun to bloom in deeper hues, fading yellow near the jawline, purple still dense at the center. Dr. Morrison examined it carefully, then stepped back and snapped 2 photographs. Flash off, quiet, intentional. "Do you want these sent directly to your attorney?" she asked. "Yes," Evelyn said, "and I'll take printed copies as well." The nurse returned with a clipboard, having printed out a standardized report for patient-initiated documentation. Evelyn signed the bottom in firm cursive loops, her fingers steady as ever. Her signature hadn't changed since the day she and Charles signed the mortgage papers in 1987. Outside, the trees rustled beneath a clear Virginia sky. Evelyn stepped back into her coat and thanked the staff on her way out. No small talk, no unnecessary apologies, just business handled. That afternoon, Evelyn met Jenna in the dining room, now cleared of its holiday linens and crystal. Only the hardwood table remained, bare and clean. Jenna stood beside it, holding a single sheet of paper. "I wrote what I saw," she said, setting it down. "And what I felt." Evelyn picked it up and read. It wasn't long. No embellishment, just the facts in Jenna's unmistakable handwriting, calm, observant, devastating. "I saw my father slap my grandmother across the face. There was no accident, no self-defense. It was an act of rage. I was afraid." Evelyn didn't speak for a long moment. "Will this help?" Jenna asked quietly. "It already has," Evelyn replied. "You've done something most adults never do. You told the truth when it wasn't convenient." They placed the statement beside the medical file. Then Evelyn reached for her phone and called Walter. He answered with his usual dry tone. "Everything's ready," she said. "Physical documentation, witness affidavit." "Then we file everything today," Walter said. "And Evelyn, let me add something else to the packet." Across the street, Carolyn Mays stood on her porch, a mug of sweet tea cradled in both hands. Her knit shawl flapped gently in the breeze. Evelyn approached her with the calm of someone who had made peace with being watched. After 30 years of living across from Carolyn, she no longer resented the scrutiny. Some people used gossip to pass time. Carolyn used it like a ledger. She remembered everything. "I heard the yelling Thursday night," Carolyn said before Evelyn had spoken. "And I saw him storm out yesterday morning. You all right?" "I'm filing something official," Evelyn said plainly. "I could use a statement from someone who's seen things." Carolyn didn't blink. "I've seen him yell at you from the driveway, curse loud enough I had to shut my window. He's been stomping through this street like he owns it since the day Charles passed." Evelyn handed her a note card. "You could write that down?" Carolyn gave a short, satisfied nod. "I'll do better. I'll type it." By sunset, Walter had scanned the complete petition. Physical abuse photos, a minor's statement, financial misconduct, neighbor affidavit. It was a wall of quiet facts. Unshakable. The following morning, Melanie opened her laptop at the breakfast bar and clicked furiously through social media apps. Her latest post read, "Sometimes family forgets loyalty. You don't betray blood just because someone has a bad night." The comments came in quickly, but not the way she'd hoped. "He hit his mother? There's no bad night excuse for that." "This you?" A reply with a screenshot of her old post mocking Evelyn's memory. "Loyalty isn't the same as silence. Grow up." Melanie closed the screen and looked up at David, who was pacing in the kitchen, muttering about legal overreactions and invasions of privacy. They hadn't realized what Evelyn had done. She hadn't just pushed back. She had built a case, a solid, bloodless evidentiary wall no tantrum could shake. The scent of rosemary and simmering broth drifted through the house hours before dinner, but it did little to soften the tension that clung to every wall. Evelyn stood at the stove, stirring Jenna's favorite beef stew, a recipe passed down from her own mother, the kind that tasted like warmth and memory and long-forgotten safety. Outside the kitchen window, dusk settled over Roanoke with a dusky haze. The trees stood still, like they too were holding their breath. The house had turned into a quiet battlefield. No screaming that day. Just tight silence, the kind that bends around corners and sharpens the air. David hadn't spoken to Evelyn since the petition was filed. He had stomped through the hallways, muttering about lawyers and betrayal, but hadn't dared knock on her door again. Melanie, for her part, had withdrawn entirely, slinking between rooms with a kind of practiced detachment. Now, the dinner hour approached, and no one made a move to set the table. No one except Evelyn. She laid out 4 bowls, polished silverware, and cloth napkins with practiced elegance. She placed a pitcher of sweet tea and a basket of cornbread at the center, then ladled the stew into each bowl, careful not to spill even a drop. Across from her, Jenna sat quietly, elbows off the table, her eyes following every motion. She hadn't spoken much since Walter submitted the restraining clause, but something about the set of her jaw had changed. She no longer looked like a child bracing for disappointment. She looked like someone watching a tide finally turn. Evelyn set one bowl down in front of Jenna and smiled softly. "I added extra carrots. Just how you like it." Jenna smiled back, hesitant but real. "I noticed." The third bowl Evelyn placed across from Jenna, David's spot, but just as quickly as she set it down, she picked it up again. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. David entered the dining room, his phone in one hand, a glass of something darker in the other. He didn't say hello. He didn't sit. He reached across the table and grabbed the bowl intended for him. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped forward, took the bowl from his hand, and returned it to the counter without a word. Then she turned and faced him squarely. "Guests eat in this home," she said, her voice clear, unflinching. "Not abusers." David blinked. Once. Twice. Like he'd just been slapped again, only this time it was with something colder than a hand. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words never made it out. His jaw clicked shut. He stood there for a long second, then scoffed under his breath and walked out without a sound. Melanie, who had peeked in from the hallway just in time to catch the moment, turned away and vanished. Jenna sat frozen, her spoon hovering midair. Then she lowered it gently, looked up at her grandmother, and smiled. Slowly, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has just seen, for the first time, what standing up actually looks like. "Thank you," she whispered. Evelyn returned to her seat, picked up her own spoon and began to eat. They didn't speak for a while. The room was quiet, except for the soft clink of silverware and the low hum of the heater kicking on. It wasn't peace yet, but it was dignity. That was enough for tonight. After dinner, Evelyn sat in her study beneath the yellow lamplight and penned a dozen identical letters by hand. She addressed each one carefully: her sister in Maryland, Charles's cousin in Tennessee, the old church deacon who still sent holiday cards every year. The note inside was brief, direct. There was an incident on Thanksgiving involving David. "I've taken legal action. He and Melanie will be moving out by court order. Please direct any concerns to my attorney, Walter Green. I won't be debating this decision." She slid the stack into envelopes, sealed them one by one, and laid them in a neat pile beside the front door for morning pickup. No explanation, no apology, just the truth. The branch manager at Roanoke First Federal didn't even blink when Evelyn slid the notarized documents across the desk. "This won't take long," the woman said with polite efficiency, typing quickly behind the glass screen. "Once your new account is active, we'll close the joint one by end of day. The final balance will be transferred immediately." Evelyn nodded, her fingers gently resting on her handbag, calm and unmoved. The joint account had been created years ago when David insisted he help her manage the bills. At the time, Evelyn, still grieving Charles and overwhelmed by probate paperwork, had agreed out of exhaustion, not trust. Now, the numbers no longer belonged to him. Not the checking, not the emergency savings, not even the small auto draft fund he used to treat as his personal slush pool. "Would you like paper statements or digital only?" the teller asked. Evelyn smiled slightly. "Both." By lunchtime, the electricity, water, and internet bills had been rerouted to her new email address and updated to her name alone. She declined phone confirmations from each provider, requesting written confirmations instead. Her voice never raised. Her posture never faltered. Power didn't always shout. Sometimes it signed its name in blue ink and asked for 2 copies. At 3 o'clock, Melanie sat at the kitchen counter refreshing the screen of her credit card app. The processing banner flickered, then disappeared, declined. She stared at the message, blinking once. She tried again. Different card, different vendor. Another red rejection banner popped up. "Please try again or contact customer service." David walked into the room at that moment, holding a half-eaten sandwich in one hand and a glass of soda in the other. He barely looked up. "Did you buy gas on the joint?" Melanie asked, her voice brittle. "No," David said, chewing. "Why?" She turned the screen toward him. "I just got flagged." He shrugged. "That's your problem." Melanie sat in silence for a moment. Then, with a controlled breath, she pulled out her phone and began to type, searching for new cards, alternate options, anything. But a weight had settled on her. It wasn't just about credit, it was about access, or the lack of it. They weren't just being shut out, they were being unwritten. That evening, Evelyn sat in the sunroom with her laptop open on her knees, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Her fingers hovered over the Facebook status box for only a moment before she typed exactly what she meant to say. Boundaries are not bitterness. No hashtags, no explanation. She hit post and closed the laptop. Within minutes, reactions began to filter in. Likes, hearts, comments from old friends and former colleagues. Amen. You've always had grace, Evelyn. Still do. Hope you're okay. You deserve peace. She didn't reply to any of them. She didn't need to. The message wasn't for attention. It was a line drawn, clean, permanent. In the hallway that led to her office, Jenna moved boxes out of the linen closet, sorting them into piles. Keep, trash, donate. She paused when she saw one labeled in permanent marker, Estate Draft 2, updated. She didn't open it, just stared at the words, fingers resting lightly on the lid. "Grandma?" she called softly. Evelyn stepped into the hall. Her eyes moved to the box, then back to her granddaughter. She didn't look caught. She looked prepared. "That's the most recent draft," Evelyn said. "Since the hearing, I added a few clarifications." Jenna looked down. "You trust me with this?" Evelyn smiled faintly, her voice gentle but certain. "You're the only one I trust to understand legacy, not just what it's worth, but what it means." Jenna didn't answer. She simply knelt, lifted the box carefully, and walked it into Evelyn's study like it was made of porcelain. The courthouse in downtown Roanoke wasn't grand. Built of aging limestone and flickering fluorescence, it smelled faintly of dust and old paper. But to Evelyn, walking through its doors that morning felt like stepping into a cathedral, not of faith, of reckoning. She wore a charcoal gray wool coat, the one she'd bought after Charles's funeral. Her heels clicked steadily against the polished tile, neither hurried nor hesitant. Beside her walked Jenna, hair pulled back in a clean ponytail, her hands folded over a manila envelope pressed to her chest. Walter Green met them at the security checkpoint with his usual practical warmth. "Room 214, he said, holding open the inner door. "They're running 5 minutes behind, just enough time to review." Trailing behind them, Carolyn Mays adjusted her oversized purse strap and offered Evelyn a nod. "Just say the word," she murmured. "I've got the affidavit right here, and a good memory." Together, the four of them stepped into the courtroom. Neutral walls, empty gallery seats, a raised bench. The space felt colder than outside. David arrived alone. He entered 10 minutes late, his shirt slightly wrinkled, sunglasses still perched on his head like an afterthought. He hadn't shaved. He wore the cocky smirk Evelyn had seen 1,000 times before, usually right before a lie. No Melanie in sight, just David looking around like he expected someone to recognize him and shake his hand. Instead, he locked eyes with Evelyn. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just turned back toward Walter and handed him the binder she'd assembled. Evidence tabbed in color-coded order, with summaries on the first page of each section. Her life, her bruises, her years of swallowed grief, flattened onto paper, made presentable for the record. At the last moment, the door creaked open again. Melanie stood at the threshold in a blazer 2 sizes too small and boots too high for a courtroom. She didn't step inside. She stayed in the hallway, arms crossed, face unreadable, as if unsure whether to ally with shame or strategy. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Evelyn inhaled once, deep and clean. They began with procedural questions, names, dates, petition types. Walter spoke clearly, without flourish. Then came the evidence presentation. First, the photos. 2 5x7 glossies of the fading bruise along Evelyn's jaw, then the financial records showing David's misuse of joint funds, unapproved withdrawals, a charge for a $600 smartwatch 3 days after Thanksgiving. Then Carolyn's signed statement, complete with dates and observations of shouted threats from the driveway. David shifted in his seat, arms folded. "This is exaggerated," he muttered, loud enough to interrupt. The judge looked at him once, unimpressed. "You'll have time to respond. For now, we listen." Then came the final envelope. Evelyn turned to Jenna. The girl rose, silent but sure, and stepped forward. She handed the envelope directly to the bailiff, who passed it to the bench. The judge unfolded the single handwritten page, eyes scanning line by line. The silence stretched. Evelyn stared at the judge's hands, not her face. Jenna looked down at her shoes. Carolyn straightened her spine. Walter folded his glasses in his lap. After a long moment, the judge looked up. "Miss Parrish," she said to Jenna, "do you stand by this statement, under oath?" Jenna looked up, her voice soft but unmistakable. "Yes, Your Honor." "And is there anything you'd like to add today?" Jenna hesitated, then stepped forward one pace. "I'm not afraid anymore." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. David scoffed, laughed under his breath. "This is a performance," he muttered. "This is my daughter playing hero because someone told her to." The judge turned to him. "Mr. Parrish, that's enough. One more outburst, and you will be asked to wait outside." He looked around the room, saw no one on his side, and finally, mercifully, shut up. The eviction order arrived by certified mail 2 days after the hearing. David never opened it. He let it sit on the kitchen counter, unopened, half covered by junk mail and a pizza flyer, like it could expire if ignored. But the house knew. The walls felt tighter, the hallways more narrow. Every doorknob seemed cooler to the touch. When the movers pulled into the driveway on Saturday morning, Evelyn was already in the sunroom, sipping tea, a book open in her lap. She didn't look up. She had nothing left to say. Upstairs, the chaos had begun. David's voice echoed through the walls, gruff, clumsy rage, closet doors thrown open, drawers yanked, hangers scraping across metal bars. Boxes were shoved half full of tangled wires and dress shirts he hadn't worn since before Charles died. A framed photo from his college days fell face down and cracked against the hardwood. "God damn this house," he muttered, voice raw from shouting at no one. "She can't do this." Melanie stood in the doorway, arms crossed. She hadn't packed a thing. Instead, she watched him move like a man setting fire to his own ship. "Maybe if you just talk to her," she began, but David whipped around. "Oh, now it's my problem alone? You stayed too, Mel. You lived here just as rent-free as I did. She's your mother. She's a manipulative control freak." But even as he shouted, his hands trembled. The kind of tremble that lives between disbelief and collapse. Downstairs, Melanie found Evelyn in the foyer, sliding mail into its usual basket. "He's just upset," she said softly, as if the volume would cushion the plea. "This isn't who he really is." Evelyn didn't. "Stop moving." She placed the last envelope down, turned, and met Melanie's eyes with terrifying calm. "Then let him be," she said. "The door locks behind him." Melanie opened her mouth but said nothing. There was no ground left to bargain from. As boxes piled near the front entrance, the movers looked increasingly uneasy. They weren't used to this kind of job, one done under a court order, with 2 clients barely speaking and one woman observing from a nearby armchair like a quiet sentinel. "Do you want this dining set packed too?" one asked David. He waved a dismissive hand. "Number she can keep it. Probably too heavy for her to lift anyway." Evelyn didn't respond. She had already paid to have the locks rekeyed the moment the truck left the driveway. Jenna came downstairs carrying a laundry basket of folded sweaters. As she passed David's room, she didn't slow down. When his door opened suddenly, she didn't flinch. "Jenna," David said, stepping into the hall, his voice rough but lowered now. "You know this isn't right. This is still my home too." She stopped at the top of the stairs. "No," she said. "You just never stopped acting like it was." Then she walked to her room, turned the knob, and closed the door with finality. Inside, she clicked the new keypad lock into place. No tears, no hesitation, just peace. By late afternoon, the final box had been taped, labeled, and stacked. The movers began to load them into the truck. Evelyn stood near the porch, arms crossed loosely, eyes shaded by the brim of her hat. David walked up to her, sweating and flushed, his breath sharp from hours of tension. "I want my share," he said bluntly. "You can't evict me from what's mine." Evelyn didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, the same one that had gone to court. She opened it slowly, pulled one page free, and handed it to him. "The deed," she said. "Dated, signed, and filed the year after your father passed. I'm the sole owner. Always have been." David blinked at the paper, then squinted, rereading the header. His fingers curled at the edges. "You never told me this." "You never asked," Evelyn said simply. He looked up at her like a man standing on a floor that had just been yanked away. "You think this ends with me leaving?" he asked, voice shaking. "You think that's all it takes to erase family?" Evelyn didn't answer. She just stepped back as the truck door slammed shut behind him. The room had once been a guest space, rarely used, mostly forgotten. A holding place for folded linens and half-done projects. But now, with David and Melanie gone and the house reclaimed, it was being reimagined. Jenna stood on a step stool by the window, gently peeling down the faded navy curtains. Evelyn folded them neatly as they came down, setting them aside for donation. The walls were still eggshell beige, but small nail holes and scuffed corners showed where David had hung photos, plaques, reminders of who he thought he was owed to be. "I think a lighter color," Evelyn said, holding up 2 paint chips against the wall. "Something clean, not precious." Jenna stepped down and picked the softer shade. A pale wheat, almost like parchment. "This one feels like a new start." By mid-morning, the furniture had been rearranged. The bulky dresser David had left behind, too scratched and swollen to move, was hauled to the curb. Evelyn's hands were steady on the paint roller, moving with quiet rhythm. She hadn't painted a room in over a decade, but the motion came back easily. Jenna trimmed the edges carefully with a brush. They worked without music, without chatter, just the low rustle of brush strokes and the light squeak of the ladder. Their silence wasn't strained, it was shared. By noon, the sun filtered softly through bare windows and fresh paint. Evelyn opened the small trunk at the foot of the bed, once filled with winter blankets, and pulled out a folded tablecloth, cream linen, hand-stitched roses along the hem, the same one that had sat beneath the Thanksgiving disaster. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she stood, walked out to the backyard, and clipped it to the edge of the fire pit bowl. She didn't look back at the house when she struck the match. The linen caught fast, curling in at the edges, the flames darkening the roses first. Jenna appeared in the doorway, holding a vase of fresh tulips. Evelyn turned to her. "The cloth's gone." Jenna didn't ask why. She simply nodded and stepped inside to place the tulips on the guest room's window ledge. When Evelyn returned, the air smelled of paint and new beginnings. The guest room didn't feel like a guest room anymore. It felt like possibility. An hour later, Carolyn Mays rang the doorbell holding a lattice-top apple pie wrapped in a dish towel. Evelyn opened the door before the second chime. "You always know when to show up," Evelyn said, ushering her in. "I was sitting on my porch and saw those boxes leave like they owed the street money," Carolyn replied with a smirk. "That was some eviction toast, Evelyn." "I didn't toast," Evelyn said, smiling faintly. Carolyn handed over the pie. "Maybe not out loud." They sat in the kitchen while the pie cooled on the counter, the silence punctuated only by the ticking wall clock. Jenna patted in and poured 3 glasses of lemonade without needing to be asked. It was becoming their rhythm, this intergenerational choreography of earned peace. Later that evening, Jenna stood at the front hallway's keypad panel. She opened the back, installed fresh batteries, and adjusted the programming. A soft beep followed each keystroke. Evelyn leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed. "New code?" "Yours, mine, and Walter's," Jenna said, closing the panel. "Everyone else calls first." Evelyn nodded, pride quietly warming her expression. "This house has rules now." They stood in the entryway for a moment, both watching the door. Not waiting for someone to arrive, just appreciating the stillness of no one coming through it. Before bed, Evelyn sat down with her insurance policy binder. She adjusted the dwelling value, removed David from her emergency contact list, and added Jenna in his place. She placed a yellow sticky note on the cover that read, "Update with trust attorney next. Legacy folder pending." Her hand lingered over the file for a second longer than necessary, not because she was unsure, because it finally felt finished. The bell above the coffee shop door gave a hollow jingle as Evelyn stepped inside. The place was quiet for a weekday afternoon, just a few students hunched over laptops and a mother in the corner spooning yogurt into a toddler's mouth. She spotted Melanie immediately. She was already seated, back straight, phone face down on the table, a tall latte untouched in front of her. Her outfit was carefully assembled, but the seams were trying too hard. Designer jacket, chipped nail polish, makeup just enough to look awake, not enough to hide the fatigue under her eyes. Evelyn walked over, unbuttoning her coat with slow precision. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Melanie said, her voice lighter than expected. Evelyn took her time settling into the chair across from her. "You asked. I've answered worse calls." A waitress stopped by. Evelyn ordered hot water with lemon. No small talk followed. Melanie glanced around, then leaned forward, fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of her cup. "I saw it happen," she said quietly. "Thanksgiving. I saw him hit you." Evelyn said nothing. The silence between them pressed hard. Melanie looked up, her eyes glassy. "I should have said something. I should have stopped him. But I froze." Evelyn stirred her water. The lemon bobbed in slow circles. "You did freeze," she said finally, "but freezing is still choosing." Melanie's breath caught. She looked down at the table, blinking hard. "I know," she whispered, "and I know I stayed too long. But it wasn't all selfish. At first it was survival. I didn't have anyone else. And later, it was easier to ignore than confront." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, watching her. "I'm not asking for pity," Melanie continued, her voice steadying. "I'm asking for not to be erased. From the family. From the trust." There it was. Melanie reached into her bag and pulled out a folded letter. "I wrote something, an explanation. I've been working on it for days. If you just read it." Evelyn held up a hand, soft but firm. "You don't need to explain to me what survival feels like," she said. "But you do need to understand what legacy costs. It's not measured in apologies or delay. It's paid for in presence. And when I needed yours, you looked away." Melanie swallowed hard. "So that's it?" Evelyn didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and placed a sealed envelope on the table. Cream stationery. No return address. Melanie stared at it, hesitant. Then slowly she picked it up and pulled the tab. Inside was a single sheet, an excerpt from the updated estate draft. Jenna's name highlighted under primary beneficiary. Walter Green listed as executor. Melanie's name, neatly struck through with a red line and a time-stamped notation in the margin. Revoked by request of Evelyn Parrish. Witnessed. Filed. Melanie looked up, her eyes wide with something between disbelief and indignation. "You already removed me." "I didn't need to wait for a conversation," Evelyn said quietly. "Your silence during his violence spoke louder than any letter you could have written." Melanie folded the paper mechanically, fingers stiff. She tucked it back into the envelope but didn't put it away. "I guess that's all I needed to know," she said, trying to keep her voice from cracking. "No," Evelyn said, rising from her seat. "It's what you already knew." She placed a few bills under her teacup and walked toward the door, her stride measured, coat swinging gently behind her. She didn't look back. The backyard looked different now. Not because the grass had grown greener or the tulips Jenna planted had finally opened, but because it felt lived in again, without tension pressing down like humidity. The patio furniture, once dusty and unused, had been wiped clean, rearranged in a circle around the fire pit. The folding table, draped in a soft linen cloth, held pitchers of iced tea, lemonade, and Evelyn's famous potato salad chilled in a glass bowl. It was the first Saturday in May. Roanoke's spring had settled into its full bloom, gentle breeze, bird song, and the smell of barbecue coals wafting faintly from a neighbor's yard. But here, at the parish house, there was no grill, no noise, no pressure to entertain. Just soft conversation, passing plates, and the quiet glow of restoration. Evelyn moved easily between the chairs, refilling drinks, straightening napkins, and gently encouraging seconds. Her pale blue sweater fluttered slightly with each breeze, and her hair, pinned back neatly, caught streaks of late afternoon light. She didn't host like a woman proving anything. She hosted like someone who had made peace with her own table. Jenna stood near the porch steps, chatting with a few friends from school. One of them, Lena, with bright sneakers and a notebook always tucked under her arm, turned to Evelyn as she approached with a tray of deviled eggs. "This is the calmest house I've ever been in," she said, not shy, not dramatic, just observant. Evelyn smiled, offering her the tray. "Took some effort." From across the yard, Carolyn raised her glass of lemonade and winked. "You made it look easy." "I didn't," Evelyn replied. "But thank you for saying so." More neighbors had come than she expected. 2 former colleagues from her teaching days, a retired librarian from across the cul-de-sac, a young couple who had moved in the winter after Charles died. Not everyone knew the full story, but they didn't need to. They knew what had changed. They could feel it. As twilight crept in, the group settled into their chairs, plates mostly emptied, glasses sweating on the side tables. The fire pit hadn't been lit, but the center of the circle glowed with something quieter than flame. Jenna rose to her feet, holding a glass of sparkling water. Her voice, when she spoke, was small but sure. "Some of you already know what this year's been like," she began, her eyes flicking briefly to Evelyn. "And some of you just showed up without needing a reason. That means everything." A pause. "So here's to strength you don't have to raise your voice for." Evelyn looked down at her glass, fingers brushing its rim. She lifted it. "To chosen family," she said. The group followed, glasses rising in soft unity. The clinking was gentle, imperfect, unsynchronized. Real. Laughter followed. Not loud, not raucous, but warm, honest. For a few minutes, Evelyn let herself lean back in her chair and simply breathe. No one was waiting to interrupt. No one was pacing inside the house. The air didn't buzz with unspoken resentment. It simply carried the sound of new voices and old comfort. Later, as the group dispersed and the backyard emptied, Jenna began gathering cups. Evelyn stood beside her, holding the lemonade pitcher, watching the last rays of sunset catch the edge of the garden fence. "You did good today," Jenna said. "We did," Evelyn corrected gently. They shared a look, one that needed no explanation. On the first Monday of June, Evelyn took the morning slow. The sky outside was a soft, unwavering blue, the kind that invited you to begin something new without needing a reason. She poured her coffee black, added 1 sugar cube, and walked out to the sunroom with a red leather folder in her hand. Jenna was already at the table with her laptop open, barefoot and focused, the hum of a scanning app filling the space. "I uploaded the last set," Jenna said without looking up. "Deed, revocation addendum, power of attorney denial, everything Walter notarized. Cloud encrypted, auto-backed up, no one's undoing this, not even with a storm." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You're sure you don't want to go into law?" "I like coding more," Jenna said, typing another line. "But Grandma, this digital archive? It's brilliant. It's not just legal protection, it's a map." A map. Evelyn turned that word over in her mind as she opened the red folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the county registrar's official stamp and seal. Finalized just that morning, bold type across the top read, "Parish Legacy Residence." Not simply a title change, a legal designation under Virginia's Homestead Preservation Code. No future inheritance claims without written consent, no probate, no contest. It meant the house could never again be weaponized against her or Jenna. "Signed, recorded, and secured," Evelyn murmured, running a fingertip across the seal. Later that day, Jenna uploaded a new section into the digital archive. She titled it, "The Guide, Notes from Evelyn Parrish." It wasn't a blog, not exactly, more like a living journal, equal parts memoir and manual. The first post had gone up 2 weeks ago. How to Make a Quiet Exit, The Anatomy of a Lock Change. Today, Evelyn typed the opening lines of a new entry. Her fingers hovered just a second before clicking the keys. Aging doesn't mean surrendering your space. It means learning which doors to lock and which to open with care, and when to say, not anymore. She sat back and read the lines aloud, not for approval, but to feel their weight outside of her head. Then she saved the file, closed the laptop, and rose from her chair. That afternoon, a new email arrived. From dparish23@hotmail.com. Subject: You win message. You got what you wanted. The house, the papers, the pity parade. Just don't expect help when you're old and need it. People forget that payback swings both ways. David. Evelyn read the email once. She didn't gasp. She didn't fume. She clicked reply, typed a single sentence, and hit send. Help never slapped me. No greeting, no sign-off, just the last word, earned. She turned off her computer and walked into the guest room, now renamed in her journal as the Legacy Room. She pulled out a small notebook from the drawer and wrote 2 new page titles at the top. Chapter 7. When Family Tries to Scare You into Silence. Chapter 8. When Silence is the Bravest Noise You Can Make. Then she placed the notebook back where it belonged, locked the drawer, and stepped outside. The wind picked up gently, brushing through the porch wind chimes. She looked up at the new plaque nailed just beside the doorbell. Parish Legacy Residence. Established 1988/protected 2025. The house didn't just feel like hers anymore, it felt future-proofed. The headline ran above the fold in the Sunday Roanoke Standard's lifestyle section, When the Matriarch Draws the Line. Evelyn read it over coffee, alone at the kitchen table. The paper, folded crisp along the center, trembled only slightly in her hands. Not from nerves, but from the gravity of seeing her life translated into someone else's language. The photograph caught her off guard. She hadn't realized the reporter snapped it during their conversation. She stood in the garden, arms crossed loosely, head tilted slightly toward the afternoon light. Her expression wasn't stern. It was resolved, proud, in a quiet way. In the background, tulips blooming, fresh painted shutters, a faint blur of the new plaque beside the front door. She traced her gaze across the headline again, then she flipped to the feature. Evelyn Parish, 72, isn't looking to make headlines. She's making boundaries. After a public restraining order, a legal eviction, and the formal reassignment of her estate, Parish has become an unlikely voice for elder autonomy. People assume age means submission, she says, but clarity isn't cruelty, it's grace with structure. Jenna padded into the kitchen in socked feet, holding her phone. She'd already read it online. Over 800 shares, she said, smiling. The comment section is wild. One guy wrote, "Reminds me of my mother. Wish she'd drawn the line sooner." Someone else said, "This is what strength looks like. No screaming, just a door that finally shut." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "They left the part out where I set a table on fire." "They hinted," Jenna said with a grin. She reached for her own laptop, clicking through tabs. A podcast mic sat on the counter now, small but professional, angled toward a chair she'd started calling her recording throne. Episode 1, The Quiet Exit, Boundaries with Elders, uploaded just that morning, already climbing regional charts in the Society and Culture category. Evelyn watched her granddaughter move with fluid certainty, editing audio, replying to comments, adjusting timestamps. She looked like someone who belonged to her own timeline now, not trapped by legacy, but reshaping it. "You're doing something good here," Evelyn said. "I'm just following your lead," Jenna replied, not looking up. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Carolyn Mays stepped in, wearing a linen jumpsuit and a shade of lipstick that hadn't been seen since the Carter administration. In her hand, a bottle of mid-shelf champagne. "They'll never forget this toast," she said, sweeping into the kitchen like she owned the morning. Evelyn laughed, an actual, full-bodied laugh, and took the bottle with mock ceremony. "Is this legal to drink before noon?" "Nothing about what you've done is traditional," Carolyn said. "Why start now?" They poured the glasses carefully, no clinking, just the soft fizz of bubbles and sunlight cutting diagonally across the tile floor. Carolyn raised her flute first. To firewood that used to be furniture, she said. And locks that only open for peace. Jenna raised hers next. To women who write the manual, not just the will. Evelyn lifted her glass last, the weight of it strangely perfect in her hand. To every door I thought I'd never close, and every room I built instead. They sipped in unison. Outside, birdsong filled the space between the hedges. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime played a few uncertain notes, then stilled. The house was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comes from absence, the kind that comes from arrival. The dining room had once been the site of 1,000 tensions, formal holidays that ended in fractured silence, birthdays thick with passive glances, too many meals where the sound of silverware masked things no one dared say. But not today. Today it was morning light and polished oak. The chairs stood evenly spaced, the tablecloth soft and fresh. Nothing extravagant, just safe, just clean. Evelyn stepped in slowly, her fingers trailing along the back of a chair as she walked past it. The room didn't hold memory the same way anymore. It held proof. Jenna sat at the far end, legs folded beneath her, a heavy envelope clutched in her lap. The kind that came with official seals and barcode stickers. She held it gently, as if opening it too quickly might dissolve something sacred inside. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, smiling. "Well?" Jenna exhaled and broke the seal. She scanned the letter once, then again, brows twitching in stunned disbelief, mouth opening just slightly. "I got in," she whispered. "Full ride, digital archives and cultural documentation track. They even want to feature my capstone podcast." Evelyn moved to sit beside her. "Of course they do." Jenna turned, eyes bright. "Grandma, how does someone like me end up here?" Evelyn looked directly at her. No hesitation. "Because you listened when it mattered. You showed up when it counted. And because you'll do better than any of them." Jenna didn't cry. Not fully. Just that trembling blink that meant everything had landed in her chest all at once. They sat like that for a few minutes, just two women on opposite ends of a generational line that had finally straightened out. Then Evelyn stood and walked to the far wall, where a bare spot had been waiting for weeks. She picked up a wooden frame from the nearby cabinet and held it up with care. Inside, the deed to the parish legacy residence, notarized, sealed, irrevocable. Below it, in matching matting, the court's stamped eviction order. She handed it to Jenna. "Ready?" Together, they lifted it onto the mounting hooks and eased it into place. It hung perfectly level. A portrait of two signatures that had rewritten an entire household. Across the room, on the mantel, sat a single wine glass. The same one Evelyn had raised all those months ago on Thanksgiving night. The bruise still fresh on her cheek, her voice low and steady. "To new beginnings," she'd said back then. Now the glass was sealed inside a shadow box, nestled in navy velvet, untouched since the night it mattered most. Above it, in Jenna's precise handwriting on a simple cream card, were 5 words. "The toast that saved us." Outside, wind brushed across the hedges, lifting the edges of the porch swing's cushion. Inside, the stillness held something different than silence. It held preservation. Jenna turned toward the mantel, eyes glimmering with something unspoken. "You kept it." "I kept everything that counted," Evelyn replied. They stood together in the doorway, the house behind them, fully intact, fully theirs. Jenna took one last look around. "It feels like you rebuilt it." Evelyn exhaled, deep, content, final. "No," she said. Then she smiled softly, the last words spoken not as defiance, but as declaration. He raised his hand. "I raised the house, and the next generation.